This man is a very famous Jewish psychologist. He used his talent to help hundreds of patients with mental illnesses return to a normal life. However, during the most passionate years of his life, he, along with millions of other Jews, was caught up in the tragic genocide by the Nazi soldiers. After being freed from the Auschwitz concentration camp, he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning, which describes his horrifying experiences while being imprisoned in a place that was like a hell on earth.
On that day, under the bright morning sun in Vienna, Viktor Frankl was strolling through the streets with his newlywed wife. Viktor was a psychiatrist and researcher in Vienna, specializing in treating depression and mental health issues. He was a man of depth, determination, and great compassion, always striving to help those struggling with emotional difficulties. At this time, he was developing his research and had just completed a book on logotherapy, a therapy that helps people find meaning in life, even in the face of adversity. But ironically, just days before the book was set to be published, an unexpected disaster struck, completely changing Viktor's life. That day, the sound of Nazi soldiers' leather boots echoed loudly through the streets of Vienna, throwing the city into chaos. The soldiers began hunting for Jewish people. Like many others, Viktor was rounded up and forced onto a train. The scene inside the cramped train car was suffocatingly crowded and filthy. The train clattered along the tracks before finally stopping at an unfamiliar station. As Viktor stepped off, the first thing he saw was a sign that read, Auschwitz. A chill ran down his spine. Auschwitz was infamous as a brutal and terrifying concentration camp. Countless lives had been lost there, making it a place of dread. Furthermore, Auschwitz was remote and isolated. Prisoners sent there lost all contact with the outside world. Viktor took a deep breath, trying to steady the fear surging within him. He knew that the fight for survival had only just begun. Viktor, along with hundreds of other prisoners, was herded into two long lines. In front of them stood a tall, thin SS officer with a cold, expressionless face, casually pointing left or right, deciding each person's fate.
To the right means work. To the left means the special camp.
Viktor overheard someone whisper. He tried to stand straight, hiding his heavy backpack, hoping to be sent to the right. The SS officer looked him over, rested a hand on Viktor's shoulder, and after a moment's hesitation turned him to the right. Viktor exhaled in relief and quickly walked in that direction, but he didn't yet understand the significance of that gesture. Later in the afternoon, while speaking with a veteran prisoner, Viktor learned the truth.
Your friend was sent to the left, wasn't he?
Viktor nodded.
See that black smoke? That's where your friend was taken. He wasn't as lucky as us.
At that moment, Viktor was stunned to realize that the seemingly arbitrary gesture was in fact a life or math judgment. This event was a profound psychological shock for Viktor. It shattered his belief in a fair and just world. At Auschwitz, a person's survival depended entirely on the arbitrary decisions of those in power. That casual pointing was a cruel symbol of the Nazi regime's indifference and brutality, where human lives were treated as worthless. Viktor began to view the world around him through a new lens. He resolved to be more cautious, more vigilant, and to mentally prepare himself for the worst at all times. Suddenly, the piercing sound of the prison alarm rang out. SS soldiers herded all the prisoners into a communal shower area and ordered them to strip off their clothes. Viktor stood in shock, clutching the manuscript of his scientific work, the most precious possession he had. In his desperation, Viktor turned to an older prisoner, clinging to the faint hope of finding empathy and help.
Please, could you keep this manuscript for me? It contains the research of my entire life. It's more valuable to me than anything else in the world.
The prisoner glanced at Viktor, then smirked. At first there was pity in his expression, but it quickly turned to ridicule and scorn.
Do you really think you'll survive long enough to leave this place? And you're worried about some book?
He scoffed. With that, the prisoner threw the manuscript to the ground. The act jolted Viktor to his core. The manuscript, the product of half a lifetime's work, was nothing more than a pile of worthless paper in the eyes of others. It was a painful awakening. Viktor realized he could no longer cling to the past. The harsh reality of his situation demanded that he let go of old values and learn to adapt to this new and brutal world. He understood that survival required embracing the present and abandoning what no longer served him in this unforgiving environment. One morning, as Victor stood in line waiting for his food ration, a piercing scream broke out behind him. He turned around to see an SS soldier knocking a prisoner to the ground.
Get up! Get up now!
The soldier screamed sharply. The prisoner tried to stand, his pale face twisted in pain. But before he could steady himself, the soldier struck him down again. Victor felt his heart clench. He wanted to rush over to help, but his body froze. His mind warned him to stay still. Any action could make him the next target. In the days that followed, Victor witnessed even more horrifying scenes. Prisoners beaten to death, skeletal bodies thrown onto carts like torn sacks. Slowly, the horror and grief began to fade. Victor grew numb, detached. He watched others around him suffer and die without feeling anything. This apathy became his shield, a protective layer that insulated him from overwhelming anguish and allowed him to endure the hell of Auschwitz. Every morning, Victor would silently converse with his wife, as if she were still by his side. Her voice, her smile, her gaze, all of it remained vividly alive in his mind. But then, like a flash of lightning, a question struck him.
Is she still alive?
Victor didn't know, and there was no way to find out. The pain of separation and the helplessness weighed heavily on him, filling him with despair. However, Viktor Frankl was a man of strong will. He soon overcame his despair by rethinking the nature of love. He discovered a profound truth.
Love is not tied to the physical presence of a person. Its deepest meaning lies in the mind, in the human spirit. Whether the person still exists or not, whether they are alive or gone, does not change the essence of love.
His love for his wife became like a small flame, warming his soul amid the frozen winter of Auschwitz. It reminded him that beauty and goodness still existed in the world, giving his life meaning and fueling his faith in the future. At lunchtime, as the prisoners stood in line waiting for their turn, a loud shout tore through the grim silence. A young prisoner, his face pale with hunger, was dragged out of line by an SS soldier and beaten mercilessly. His crime? Hiding a piece of bread for a friend who was on the verge of collapse. Victor watched the scene unfold, his heart twisting in anguish.
Why would he do that? Isn't he just throwing his life away?
Victor thought, silently blaming the prisoner for being
reckless and foolish.
In the brutal reality of Auschwitz, survival was supposed to be the highest priority. Victor hadn't yet fully broken free from the mindset of the normal world, where self-preservation was paramount. But then another thought arose in his mind.
Would I be capable of doing the same for a friend?
The question left Victor deep in thought. He began to realize that in such harsh conditions, friendship and compassion became more precious than ever. The young prisoner's act, though reckless, was also profoundly noble. It was an act of sacrifice, giving without expecting anything in return out of love and faith in humanity. Victor came to understand that sacrifice was not a loss, but a way to affirm the highest values of humanity. From that moment on, the conflict between the instinct for self-preservation and the capacity for compassion became clearer to Victor. This struggle ultimately helped him shift his perspective from self-interest to selflessness, from fear to admiration and respect for the nobility of the human spirit. It sparked within Victor a renewed belief in the goodness of people and the meaning of life, even in the darkest of places. That winter descended on Auschwitz, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed to cut through flesh and bone. Victor and the other prisoners were forced to endure grueling labor for hours on end, their bodies weakened by hunger and the bitter cold. Each swing of the pickaxe felt like torture, and every step on the snow-covered ground was an agonizing ordeal. Victor's fellow countrymen had grown frailer by the day, coughing incessantly and often lapsing into delirium. Concerned for his friend, Victor made the selfless decision to share his meager bread ration with them. Then, one morning, as Victor tried to focus on his work to distract himself from the biting cold and gnawing hunger, disaster struck. A foreman, his face flushed with anger, stormed toward Victor, observing him for a moment before barking insults.
Hey, you! Why are you working so slowly like a useless slug? Move faster, or do you want to end up in a sack?
Victor kept his head down, saying nothing. The foreman sneered, pressing on.
What did you do before you got here? A businessman, huh?
For a fleeting moment, Victor wanted to shout out who he really was, but he quickly let go of the idea, knowing that defiance would only worsen his situation. Standing tall, he met the foreman's gaze and replied with steady determination.
I'm a doctor, a specialist.
A doctor?
The foreman mocked.
You must have made plenty of money off people, huh?
I treated the poor for free. Don't assume everyone is like you.
The foreman's face turned crimson with rage. He lunged at Victor, beating him mercilessly, his voice erupting in a storm of rage like a demon unleashed. Despite the brutal blows, Victor endured the pain. His body ached with every strike, but his spirit refused to break. In those moments of unimaginable hardship, Victor's resolve and faith grew even stronger. He returned to his work, though each swing of the pickaxe felt heavier and each step more arduous, yet within him burned a flicker of hope, a fragile yet unyielding belief in life. He reminded himself of a simple truth. As long as he was alive, there was hope, and he vowed never to surrender to despair, no matter how dire his circumstances became. 3 long years in the hell of Auschwitz seemed endless. Victor and the other prisoners continued their struggle against brutality and death every hour of every day. In the cramped, damp infirmary hut, Victor lay curled up on a rotting straw mattress. His body was thin and emaciated after years of imprisonment in Auschwitz. Darkness and silence surrounded him, broken only by the occasional cough or moan from the other sick prisoners. They clung to the fragile hope of one day returning home, of breathing the air of freedom once again. But as the war grew fiercer, the Nazi forces began to weaken. The SS soldiers started evacuating prisoners from the concentration camps, forcing them on deadly marches. Fear hung over Auschwitz as the prisoners knew they could be killed at any moment. The International Red Cross tried to negotiate with the Nazis to gain access to the camps, but the situation remained tense. Witnessing the death of his friends, Victor's faith began to waver. He lay there, staring blankly at the filthy ceiling. His body was exhausted and his spirit was crushed. He clung tightly to his torn backpack, inside which were a few spoiled potatoes and the manuscript of a book he had been trying to reconstruct from scraps of paper. His constant worry for his own fate, for his sick fellow countrymen, and for the other prisoners tormented him daily. His desire for freedom grew stronger, but it was also filled with doubt and anxiety. Then, on April 27, 1945, the American Army liberated the Turkheim camp, a subcamp of Dachau, where Viktor Frankl had been held. The camp gate was thrown open and a white flag waved in the wind. Viktor was free. He had survived the hell of Auschwitz thanks to both luck and his extraordinary resilience. The gates of Auschwitz were opened, and Viktor, along with the other prisoners, stepped out, as if returning from the other side. They were disoriented in the new, unfamiliar world, their eyes stunned, unable to believe the harsh truth. They were free. Freedom came so suddenly, like a dream Viktor couldn't believe was real. He looked around at the world. Everything seemed strange and new. 3 years in the concentration camp had felt like being cut off from the flow of time, making him feel lost and unable to adapt.
Tell me, are you happy today?
A prisoner quietly asked his friend.
Not really.
Came the hesitant reply. Freedom arrived so abruptly that they had lost the ability to feel joy. The 2 words, freedom, had been spoken countless times during their years of imprisonment, to the point where they had lost their true meaning. Viktor looked at his fellow prisoners. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes empty. He understood that they needed time to adjust to freedom, to learn how to feel joy and happiness again. He also understood that true freedom wasn't just physical release, it was a mental liberation, the ability to choose and determine one's own life. That was the true meaning of freedom. Returning to his old hometown of Vienna, Victor carried a heart full of hope. He imagined the moment of reuniting with his beloved wife, her radiant smile, and the warm embrace that would erase all the pain and separation. He longed to tell her everything he had been through, the suffering, the losses, and even the glimmers of light in the darkness of Auschwitz. But fate was cruel. Tilly, his beloved wife, was no longer alive. She had died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The news was like a bolt of lightning, leaving Victor shattered. The beautiful world he had imagined suddenly crumbled, and the bright future he had envisioned disappeared like smoke. Victor was left in despair, painful, and lost in the very freedom he had longed for. However, Viktor Frankl was not someone who could easily be defeated. His survival instincts and strong will helped him stand tall in that dark moment. Then Victor remembered the words of Nietzsche, a philosopher who played an important role in helping him rise above the darkest of times.
He who has a why to live for can endure almost anyhow.
He thought of the patients he saw in Vienna, many of whom carried their own scars from the war. They were suffering, confused, and in need of someone to understand them and lift their spirits. They needed him. They needed his help, understanding, and compassion. Victor decided to stay in Vienna. He would continue his work, using the experiences and lessons from Auschwitz to heal the wounded souls around him. He chose reconciliation over revenge, and he chose to believe in the meaning of life even when faced with tragedy. This was how Viktor Frankl overcame his grief and found new meaning in his life, continuing his journey of man's search for meaning. He believed that reconciliation was better than revenge, and that life always had meaning, even when we face the greatest tragedies. Victor returned to his career in psychology, bringing with him valuable lessons from the concentration camp and a deep desire to use them to heal wounded souls. He remarried Eleanor, a kind nurse who brought joy and happiness into his post-war life. He continued to dedicate himself to psychology, helping others overcome difficulties and find meaning in their lives. However, Victor realized that traditional psychology, with theories from Freud and Adler, could not fully explain his experiences in the concentration camp. He felt the need for a new direction, a therapeutic approach that focused more on the search for meaning in life rather than on unconscious drives or the will to power. Victor began to research and develop logotherapy, a school of psychology based on the idea of the will to find meaning. Logotherapy was not a theory Victor invented by chance. It was the result of his personal journey of reflection and experience, particularly during his dark years in Auschwitz. He wrote books, taught, and traveled the world to share his knowledge, experiences, and beliefs. He argued that people are always searching for meaning in their lives, and that the frustration of not finding that meaning is the root cause of many mental disorders. Victor believed that logotherapy could help people recognize the hidden meaning in their lives, overcome crises, and find the motivation to live a fuller life. Ultimately, after many years of effort, Victor became one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, inspiring millions of people around the world.